It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because I had just picked up a small bundle of oranges from the farmer's market, the kind my grandson used to love as a toddler, the ones with the thin skin, easy to peel. I even brought his favorite chocolate, thinking maybe we'd sit together and talk like we used to. I'd tell him about the old railway station I used to work at, or how his father once broke a window playing baseball indoors. But when I opened the front door of my son's home, that same door I helped paint, frame by frame, I felt something had changed. It didn't hit me right away. The house smelled of rosemary and lemon-scented cleaner, the kind my daughter-in-law swore by. There was a hum of soft music upstairs, and the faint clatter of dishes. I walked in slowly, clutching the bag of fruit in one hand and a small wrapped box in the other. A gift I made myself, a wooden jewelry holder for my granddaughter. As I reached the staircase to head to my room, the guest room I'd quietly lived in for the past 3 years, I noticed something peculiar. The photo of me and my late wife that used to sit on the hallway shelf was gone. In its place was a potted plant. Fake, I think. Then I reached the landing. The door to the guest room stood open, but the bed was gone. So were my books, my slippers, the lamp with the crooked neck I used to read under. Everything was missing, replaced with a large rolled yoga mat, a tower of color-coded towels, and soft, glowing lights hung along the curtain rods. The room smelled like lavender and unfamiliarity. I turned around, puzzled. That's when I heard her voice. "Oh, Mr. Nam, you're back!" My daughter-in-law called cheerfully from the kitchen, still wearing her apron. "We just needed a bit more space. My mom's starting her yoga sessions again, and this room had the best light." I tried to find words, but before I could speak, she added with a warm smile, "Don't worry. We've made up a cozy little space for you downstairs. It's quieter, too. You'll sleep better, promise." She didn't wait for a reply. My son came in a moment later, rubbing the back of his neck, avoiding my eyes like a teenager caught sneaking in after curfew. "Dad, I meant to call you," he mumbled. "It just kind of happened fast. No discussion, no warning, just a room reassigned like a parking spot." I nodded. What else could I do? Argue that I, too, needed a bit of sunlight? That perhaps after helping them buy this house, after co-signing the mortgage, draining my savings, leaving behind the only neighborhood I ever knew, I might still deserve a door with my name on it? Instead, I made my way downstairs. The basement smelled faintly of dust and old cardboard. My belongings were neatly stacked in plastic bins against the far wall. My armchair, the one with the faded arms from years of leaning into memories, was pushed next to the laundry machine. A folded cot sat in the corner, dressed with a stiff new blanket and a pillow still wearing its plastic wrapping. My name wasn't written anywhere, but I knew this was mine now. That night, while the house filled with the laughter of upstairs, I sat alone in that chair. The couch was too low for my back, and the cot creaked under the weight of silence. I looked at the box of oranges sitting on a folding table beside me. No one had asked why I brought them. No one had even noticed. There was a time when this house had my fingerprints on every corner. I installed the light fixtures with my own hands, nailed in the floorboards with a friend from the old union. I carried in the new oven when my daughter-in-law asked for one that matched her dream kitchen. I was here through the renovations, the repairs, the births of both grandchildren. And now, they couldn't even spare me a room. It wasn't the downgrade that stung. I've slept on worse. I've slept on train benches during snowstorms just to get to work the next morning on time. I've eaten cold rice with soy sauce when the paycheck didn't stretch. I've known discomfort. This wasn't about comfort. It was about the quiet reclassification of who I was. Not a father, not a partner, not a man who spent decades building a family from scratch, but clutter. A footprint too large in a home that no longer saw him as foundational. A relic better boxed and stored than shared and seated. At one point in the evening, I heard footsteps above, perhaps my grandson running down the hall. I almost called out, hoping he'd peek in and notice I was there. Maybe he'd remember the time we built his birdhouse together, or how I used to tuck him in with stories about trees that talked. But the footsteps faded, and the door never opened. I leaned back, pulled the stiff blanket over my knees, and stared at the ceiling. That's when the thought came. I gave them the roof. Now they can't even give me a room. I whispered it out loud, as if trying to make sense of it, trying to hear how absurd it sounded. But it wasn't absurd. It was their truth, and now it had to become mine. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I walked outside for some air. The house glowed softly from the upper windows. Through the curtains, I saw them, my family, laughing at something, eating dinner. My chair was missing from the table, but no one looked out of place. I watched for a moment longer, then turned away. It wasn't rage that filled me. It wasn't even sorrow. It was something deeper, a hollowing realization that I had poured myself so fully into them that I had nothing left in me that was mine. I had given them the tools to build their life, but forgotten to keep even a corner for myself. Well, that would change. Not with a shout. Not with slammed doors or loud arguments. I was too old for that kind of drama. I wouldn't demand my space back. I would simply take back what they had quietly forgotten still belonged to me. And in doing so, remind them that just because I didn't ask for recognition doesn't mean I had nothing to offer. Some people shout to be heard. Others whisper and still shake walls. The thing about hammers is, they remember your hands. Long after the skin calluses, after the wrists ache and the knuckles stiffen in the cold, they still fit. Even now, mine sits in a rusted red toolbox that I keep under the cot in the basement. Sometimes I open it, not to fix anything, but to remind myself that I once built things people were proud to live in. Years ago, when my back was still strong and the mornings didn't come with so much pain, I worked construction. Not the glamorous kind you see in home magazines. Real work. Rain-soaked trenches. Rooftop shingles under blazing heat. Framing houses in dead winter with breath fogging my glasses and numb fingers fumbling for nails. I remember one job where I had to crawl into a crawl space barely high enough to kneel. I was 42, my back already complaining, and I had just buried my wife the year before. Cancer, quick and cruel. She went from strong to silent in 4 months. I still remember how she smelled like mint tea and wet earth, how she used to hum to herself while cooking rice. My son was 15, angry at the world, hungry for answers I didn't have. So I did what I knew. I worked through the grief, worked through the silence, worked through the fear that I was failing him, because he never really cried. Not even at the funeral. Just stood there like a stone, fists clenched, like if he stayed still enough, maybe time would rewind. I made his breakfast every morning. I packed his lunch. I tutored him in algebra even when I could barely keep my eyes open. I coached his little league team, even though I'd never played baseball in my life. I sat in bleachers after 12-hour shifts just to watch him strike out 3 times, but smile on the 4th. Every Saturday, I saved $5 from my wages. It went into a coffee tin labeled his future. I didn't know what that future would look like, only that I wanted it to be brighter than mine. No splinters, no cold steel beams, no missed birthdays because overtime came first. When he got into college, first in the family, I cried for the first time in years. Real, shaking sobs behind the garage so he wouldn't see. I paid every semester without delay, took on extra drywall gigs, skipped getting the new glasses I needed. Didn't matter. He graduated with honors. I took the bus 6 hours to see him walk across the stage. He introduced me to his girlfriend, now his wife, with a short, "This is my dad." No mention of the hammered floors or the night classes I took just to help with his calculus homework. But I didn't mind. I didn't do it for credit. When he called me years later, asking if I could help with a down payment for a house, their first home, I didn't even hesitate. I had just retired. Had plans to maybe see the sea, learn to fish again. But what was, rewired her kitchen. The grandchildren, who once traced the lines on my palm and called them treasure maps. None of them looked at me now. I didn't say a word. I just kept eating. Slowly. Carefully. Because the last thing I wanted to do was break something on their table. I had already broken in other ways. After brunch, I returned to the basement. I sat in my armchair, the one they moved without asking, and stared at the ceiling above me. I could hear them moving, their voices, their laughter, their music, all of it above, never below. The basement didn't bother me anymore, not because it was comfortable, but because it had become familiar, a place where nothing was expected of me except silence. And perhaps that's what they truly wanted. Not my presence, not my stories, just my stillness, my quiet compliance, my invisible blessing. But I had been many things in this life. Laborer, widower, father, provider. I had bent my back, sold my time, traded sleep for stability. I had poured my soul into concrete slabs, swung hammers through exhaustion, and stitched dignity into every paycheck. And now I was reduced to a shrug, a muttered "bless him," a footnote at their brunch table. I remember whispering to myself that evening, I was part of the foundation. But even cement cracks when the weight becomes insult. They never heard that line. It wasn't for them. It was for me. Because at that moment, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. Love isn't a leash. And family isn't a place you earn by staying silent. It's a space where even your flaws are honored, where your years are seen not as dust, but as light filtered through experience. And if that space no longer exists upstairs, then perhaps it's time to stop being afraid of the stairs. That night, after the brunch, after the laughter I was never part of, after the door clicked shut upstairs and the house returned to its quiet rhythm, I sat in the basement with the lamp on and opened the drawer of my old filing cabinet. Dust rose, unsettled, as if the papers inside had been holding their breath with me all these years. I pulled out a folder. The cover was faded, the edges curled from time and use. Inside were contracts, account statements, notarized signatures, and at the top, the loan agreement, the house deed, our names, his and mine, etched side by side in ink. It had been almost 15 years since we signed it, sitting across from each other in the bank, shaking hands with the lender like partners in a new dream. I remember the day vividly. He had just become a father. I was already one. He needed a home for his growing family, and I wanted to give him the head start I never had. He didn't have the credit history. I did. He didn't have enough for the down payment. I did. He didn't have time. I made time. It wasn't about control. It was about trust. Back then, I never imagined I'd need to protect myself from the very hands I once. A mirror, polished just enough to show me I'm no longer really seen. It started with small things, the little signals that say, "You're not quite one of us anymore." Like when they'd have family dinners and forget to set a plate for me. At first, I thought it was just an oversight, so I'd quietly grab one from the cupboard, set my place at the far end of the table, and eat slowly, trying not to spill anything or take up too much space. No one ever noticed. Or maybe they did, and chose silence. Then came the outings. Beach days, park walks, trips to the movies. I'd find out hours before, always with the same apologetic tone. "Oh, sorry, Dad. We figured you'd be tired. You probably wouldn't enjoy this one anyway." I'd smile, pretend to agree, then sit on the porch, watering their hydrangeas like they were the only things in this house that still needed me. The conversations hurt more than the silences. They'd talk around me, not to me. When I chimed in, my son would nod absent-mindedly, his eyes already on his phone. My daughter-in-law would give me that tight-lipped grin that said, "That's cute," even when I was talking about things I knew intimately, construction, wiring, even raising kids. Suddenly, experience wasn't wisdom. It was outdated noise. But I told myself, this is family. You endure. You love without asking for applause. Then came the Sunday brunch, the kind with avocado toast, pressed coffee, and the kind of laughter that felt too sharp to be real. I'd made a habit of staying quiet during these meals, not wanting to interrupt the rhythm of their polished lives. But that morning, as I sipped lukewarm tea from a chipped mug they'd handed me without looking, I heard my name. Not directly, not respectfully. My daughter-in-law had just finished telling a story about her yoga retreat. The conversation shifted to home renovations, how the guest room was finally perfect for her mother's new morning stretches. And then she chuckled and said, "Oh, and of course the old man who just sort of stays downstairs didn't even notice. I mean, bless him, he's harmless." Laughter. Not cruel, just careless. Even the kids giggled. My granddaughter asked, "Grandpa, do you really live in the basement like a troll?" She said it like a joke, but she wasn't old enough to know that some jokes slice deeper than silence. My son didn't laugh, but he didn't stop it either. He reached for more bacon, nodded absent-mindedly, and kept chewing. And in that moment, something inside me, not rage, not sadness, but something ancient, snapped. Not like a twig, not brittle or dramatic. It was quieter than that. Like cement finally giving way beneath too many years of weight. A subtle shift, invisible to others, but loud enough for me to hear. I looked at them. All of them. My son, the boy I once carried on my shoulders through stormy walks to school. My daughter-in-law, who once hugged me with gratitude after retirement really, if your son still needed you. I co-signed the loan, gave him part of my pension fund, helped choose the bricks, painted the front porch with him on a foggy Sunday morning, laughed when he said, "We'll always have space for you, Dad." I remember that line, clear as crystal. At first, I'd visit on weekends, bring groceries, fix squeaky doors, read stories to the kids while my daughter-in-law cooked dinner. The room upstairs was simple but comfortable. They called it Grandpa's room. I didn't live there. I didn't need to. Just being nearby was enough. But over time, I noticed things change. The invitations came less often. The meals became more formal, like I was a guest, not blood. I was asked to call before stopping by. Then I was asked to wait for holidays, then birthdays, then only big birthdays. At some point, my visits became tolerated. And tolerance, I've learned, is a slow form of exile. I stopped offering advice unless asked. I kept my toolbox in the car, only bringing it in when something broke. I smiled through moments when I was clearly forgotten, overlooked, or brushed aside. It wasn't malice. It was convenience. And convenience, when stretched long enough, turns love into an afterthought. When they finally invited me to move in, after my leg surgery, after I lost my old apartment, it wasn't framed as a welcome. It was a solution to their guilt. They said, "You'll be more comfortable here." But what they meant was, "We'll feel better if you're close, but not too close." I told myself it was temporary, that they were busy, that I shouldn't expect too much. But even the dogs stopped greeting me after a while. Still, I made myself useful. I fixed their leaky sink, rewired their garage light, planted tomatoes in the backyard so the kids would know what homegrown food tasted like. I stayed quiet, always quiet. I never once asked to be seen, but I hoped, foolishly, that they would. And then, the basement, a single gesture, like a broom pushing crumbs into the corner. Polite, efficient, final. I sat on that cot that night and thought of the hammer again, the one tool that never let me down. I remembered how it felt, cold and heavy in my grip. I remembered the rhythm it created, the beat of a man shaping futures nail by nail. And I thought, if I could build homes for others, why had I never built a space for myself? The quiet years weren't a mistake. They were offerings. My hammer swung not for glory, but for legacy. But maybe it was time to swing it once more, not to build for them, but to reclaim something for me. And so, in the quiet basement with dust clinging to the corners, I made a decision. Not loud, not angry, just firm. Like a nail driven straight into oak. There's a kind of smile that doesn't touch the eyes. I used to think it was just me being sensitive, misreading the world like an old man fumbling through new customs. But lately, those smiles have become held steady. I turned the pages slowly, reading not just the words, but everything they represented. The trust, the generosity, the invisible cost. And then, without fanfare, I made a decision. The next morning, I dressed in my cleanest shirt and walked to the bank. I didn't call ahead. I didn't ask anyone's opinion. I simply walked in like a man who remembered he still had agency. The banker was young, polished, polite, unaware of the silent weight tucked beneath my arm. When I placed the folder on the table and explained what I wanted, he blinked. "You're co-owner of the mortgage?" he asked, flipping through the files. "I am," I said. "And you want to freeze the joint account?" he clarified. "I do," I replied, evenly. "Effective today. And cancel the automatic payments." He hesitated, fingers hovering above the keyboard. "Sir, are you sure?" I smiled, not angrily, not bitterly, but with a calm forged over years of swallowing too much silence. "Let them pay for the space they made," I said. "I'm simply stepping back from a stage I'm no longer welcome on." He nodded slowly, typing with the caution of someone watching an iceberg move for the first time. By noon, it was done. The account was frozen. The payments stopped. I left with confirmation papers in my pocket and a sense of gravity in my chest. Not guilt, not vengeance, just truth. The kind that finally sits down beside you like an old friend and says, "It's time." I didn't go home, not right away. Instead, I walked to my lawyer's office, a man I hadn't seen in years, except for the occasional holiday card and the one time he helped me draft my will. He was surprised to see me, but kind. We sat in his office with the blinds half closed against the afternoon sun, and I explained that I wanted to begin the process of legally removing my name from the house, transferring responsibility, declaring independence, not out of pettiness, but precision. I don't want to own anything, I told him, where I'm not even allowed to exist. He listened, nodding as he drafted the paperwork. It'll take a few weeks, he said. There'll be signatures, legal notices, filings. I'm in no rush, I replied, but I'm not waiting anymore either. When I left his office, the first call came in, then another, and another. I didn't answer. I just stood at the edge of the sidewalk, watching the world move on as if nothing monumental had just shifted beneath my feet. A child laughed nearby. Someone honked in traffic. A dog barked from a passing car. Life didn't pause to notice what I'd done. But I noticed, and that was enough. By evening, the voicemails stacked up. My son's voice, clipped and nervous. "Dad, call me back." My daughter-in-law's voice, more accusatory. "We need to talk." What's going on? Even the children left messages, confused, unsure, relaying what they'd overheard. But I didn't press play. Not yet. I wasn't ready to hear them scramble for the comfort of the old arrangement, the one where I paid in silence and they forgot in luxury. Instead, I made tea, sat in my chair, and felt the house shift. This time not under the weight of insult, but under the lifting of obligation. For the first time in years, I wasn't financing my own erasure. It wasn't about punishing them. It was about remembering me. People talk about love as sacrifice, but real love, mature love, knows when sacrifice becomes self-erasure. And I had erased myself, pixel by pixel, favor by favor, until all that remained was a name on a loan and a presence in the basement. Not a man, a shadow of usefulness. But now, I was stepping into the light again. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with the quiet confidence of someone who finally picked up the pen to write himself back into the story. That night, I slept soundly. Not because anything had been resolved, but because, for once, I wasn't holding up a house that didn't even keep a room for me. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the cold finally settled in. Not outside, but within the walls of the house I once helped raise. The winter had come early that year, the kind that crept in quietly, like silence after a slammed door. And that morning, just as frost kissed the corners of the windows, the heater stopped humming. I wasn't there to hear it die, of course. I had long since returned to my quiet apartment, where things were small but mine, where heat still responded to my hand, and my name wasn't a burden whispered behind closed doors. But even from a distance, I could imagine it. The confusion, the cold creeping in, and the dawning realization that warmth, true warmth, doesn't come from machinery alone. By the end of the day, the panic had begun. The mortgage company called them first. Missed payment, delinquency status, formal warning. And though I wasn't there to witness the expressions on their faces, I could almost hear the voices raised, the fingers pointed. Somewhere between the broken heater and the unopened mail sat the truth they'd been ignoring. The man in the basement had been holding up more than just his breath. He'd been holding up the entire house. My phone rang that night. Not once, not twice, but 5 times in a row. I didn't answer the first four. I waited, not out of spite, but because I wanted to hear the voice that came after the panic settled, the one that would speak not from entitlement, but from recognition. When I finally picked up, his voice came through sharp, breathless. "You're putting our house at risk," he said, not even offering a greeting. I let the silence rest for a moment before answering. "No," I said quietly. "I'm just making sure the house reflects how you valued my presence. You moved me to the basement. I simply brought the roof down to the same level." He was stunned, not by the words, but by the fact that I finally said them. "I've got kids here," he shouted. "I know," I replied. "I raised one." There was a pause. I could hear his breath catching between anger and something else. Guilt, maybe, or the first flicker of perspective. He didn't hang up. He didn't apologize either. He just said, "I'm coming over." An hour later, he stood at my door, not in a suit or a jacket, but in an old hoodie, one I recognized from years ago. His eyes were tired. Not the kind of tired you get from chasing children or deadlines, but from realizing you've let something valuable slip through your fingers without even noticing. He didn't storm in. He didn't yell. He just stood there and asked, "Why didn't you say anything?" I walked to my bookshelf without a word and pulled out an old photo, the edges soft from time. In it, a much younger him sat on my lap, both of us smiling, paint on our hands, as we built a tiny wooden toy house together. The caption I'd written decades ago still showed in faded ink. "A house is more than walls. It's who you make room for." I handed it to him. He looked at it, eyes scanning every corner, as if seeing it for the first time. Not just the photo, but what it meant. His hands trembled slightly. "I didn't think—" I nodded gently. "That's the problem. You didn't." He sat down slowly, no longer the man who spoke in orders or rushed to justify himself. Just a son who finally saw what had been in front of him all along. "I thought you were okay downstairs. I thought you liked the quiet." "I do like the quiet," I said, "but I never liked being hidden in it." He looked down, and for a long while, we said nothing. The heater hadn't broken the house. It had only exposed the cracks. Finally, he asked, "Is it too late to fix it?" I let the question hang, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I wanted him to hear the echo of it in his own heart. Then I said, "Some things can't be rebuilt with money. But rooms, real rooms, can always be made, if you care enough to try." He left that night without resolution. But something in his shoulders, in the way he walked down my front steps, told me he was carrying something heavier than responsibility now. He was carrying the weight of awareness. The next morning, a knock at my door brought a small package. No return address. Just a note attached that read, "I found this in the attic. I think it belongs with you." Inside was the old engraved hammer I'd given him when he graduated college. "Build well, live better," it read. I had thought it lost, buried under new tools, new ambitions. But now, it had found its way home. That night, for the first time in weeks, I turned the heat down in my own apartment. Not out of frugality, but because for the first time in years, I felt something warmer than a thermostat humming in my chest. My son hadn't said sorry. He hadn't promised anything. But in the quiet exchange of a photo, a hammer, and a few honest words, we had begun to rebuild, board by board, breath by breath. Because sometimes the heater breaks, and sometimes so do people. But when both sit in the cold long enough, they start to remember what warmth really means. The house, once so full of my breath and my sacrifice, now sat in limbo, its walls paid for with years of my labor, its rooms redesigned without my voice. And yet, I no longer felt tethered to it. Freedom, I learned, isn't always about leaving. Sometimes it's about finally being uninvited and realizing you no longer needed to knock. I found solace in a place without doors I built, just open ones I was welcomed into. A local carpentry workshop had been running downtown for a few years, a space where single fathers, many barely out of their teens, came to learn how to build with their hands what they hadn't seen built in their lives: security, patience, dignity. I walked in one afternoon and offered my time, not as an instructor, but as someone who'd once built a home for love and watched it forget the shape of my hands. At first, I simply handed out tools, adjusted measurements, gave quiet nods of encouragement. But slowly, they began to ask questions. Not just about wood grain or hammer weight, but about life, about fatherhood, about how to stay when it feels easier to disappear. One young man, barely 20, with sleeves rolled up and eyes that carried too many midnights, looked at me after class one day and said, "No one's ever taught me what a real dad looks like." I didn't say anything right away. I just picked up a chisel, ran my fingers along its edge, and then said, "A real dad doesn't just build. He remembers who he builds for, even when they forget." He nodded slowly, as if trying to carve the words into something stronger than memory. In those moments, surrounded by sawdust and silence, I felt more useful than I had in years. I wasn't just a man tucked into a basement. I was a man standing straight again, handing down more than tools. I was handing down identity. Meanwhile, across the city, the house I had left behind began to crack, not from weather or rot, but from within. My son called a few times. I didn't answer right away, not out of bitterness, but because I was listening, to laughter in the workshop, to stories of boys trying to be better men than the ones who left them. I didn't want to silence that with the sound of guilt on a line. Eventually, I answered. His voice was different this time, not sharp, not demanding, but lost. "Dad," he said, "I know I messed up." I didn't jump to soothe him. That was the old me, the one who always patched holes before the wind could teach a lesson. He went on, "The kids keep asking where you are. Jenna, she doesn't get it. Says it was just a room, but the whole house feels off, like it's missing something." I smiled faintly. "It's not something," I said. "It's someone." There was a long pause. Then he said, "I went into the basement the other day. Your chair's still down there. I sat in it. Couldn't stop crying." That chair, the old recliner with its worn armrest and faded fabric, had once been my refuge. I had read bedtime stories in it, soothed fevers, whispered lullabies. It had held generations of warmth. But it wasn't the chair that mattered. It was what it represented: presence, permanence, patience. I didn't offer to come back. He didn't ask me to. Some bridges don't need to be rebuilt. They need to be walked slowly, board by board, with time in between steps. Instead, I returned to the workshop, where the smell of pine and the sound of sandpaper gave me peace. One afternoon, we were working on a project, a wooden chest for one of the young fathers to give to his daughter. He'd carved her name into the lid with shaky hands, terrified he'd ruin it. I guided him gently, showed him how to steady his grip. When we finished, he looked at the chest and then at me, his voice low. She's gonna keep all her drawings in here. She'll remember your hands every time she opens it, I said. He smiled. That's all I want. And I realized that had been all I'd wanted too. Not applause, not nameplates, just memory. Just moments where someone, years later, would trace a finger along a groove I had once carved and say, he was here. That night I received a small envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a crayon drawing. Stick figures, labeled in messy handwriting. Me, Mom, Dad, Grandpa. The figure labeled Grandpa was smiling the biggest, arms wide, holding a wooden birdhouse. The next day, I received another envelope. This time from my son. No letter, just a single brass key and a note. In case you ever want to come in through the front door again. I didn't rush to use it, but I placed it beside my workshop keys. Because a key, like a gesture, doesn't require immediate action. It just means the door is unlocked again, should I ever decide to walk through it. In the weeks that followed, my visits to the house remained few, but something had shifted. When we did meet, birthdays, holidays, small dinners, I wasn't banished to corners. My chair was upstairs again. The children ran to greet me, asking about my wood shop and if they could help next time. Their questions didn't come from guilt. They came from curiosity, from love. And though the rooms still carried the faint smell of tension and learning, they no longer felt like exile. That winter, one of the young fathers at the workshop brought his daughter by after school. She ran up to me with a lopsided birdhouse in her hands. "Mr. R," she said proudly, "I built this with Daddy." I knelt down, looked her in the eyes and said, "That's not just a birdhouse. That's a story. You two built something that can sing." As she giggled and skipped off, I turned to her father and placed a small brass key in his palm. In case she ever forgets who taught her how to open doors. He looked at me, confused. I just smiled. Because sometimes giving a key means more than offering entry. It means passing down the right to be remembered. And maybe, just maybe, that's what fatherhood really is. It happened on a Sunday. The kind of quiet morning that doesn't announce itself with a knock, just with footsteps hesitant enough to make the air feel softer. I heard them outside before I saw them, my son and his youngest, walking up the path to my small apartment. No flowers, no speeches, just a man who had finally run out of reasons not to come. I opened the door and he looked at me, not with shame or pride, but with something heavier than both, humility. I stepped aside. No need to ask why he came. He wasn't there to beg, he was there to ask, and asking when it comes from the heart is far harder than pleading. We walked. Not far, just around the neighborhood. Two figures side by side, shadows stretching longer than our words. He started slowly. "You taught me how to use a hammer," he said, voice low. "But I never asked who you used it for." I didn't answer right away. I let the silence carry that truth a little longer. We passed a house where kids were playing on a swing set. I remembered building one just like it in our old backyard. I remembered the blister on my thumb that bled through the glove. And I remembered the smile on his face when he took his first swing into the air, legs kicking like he was trying to outrun gravity itself. He glanced at me, unsure if he'd gone too far, if the air between us could still hold honesty without snapping. I nodded. "That's all I ever wanted," I said, "for you to notice." We didn't hug, we didn't cry, but something shifted. A crack opened wide enough to let grace slip through. No promises were made, but an apology was quietly implied in the way he walked beside me instead of ahead. Like maybe, finally, he understood that legacy isn't something passed down in silence. It's something earned with reverence. Later that week, we went to the bank together, sat across from the same loan officer who had once handled the down payment I fronted without hesitation. This time, I brought terms, not gifts. I agreed to assist in renegotiating the mortgage, but only under one condition. The home had to be paid under their name, their sweat, their understanding of what each brick had cost. Clear boundaries, no more assumptions. No more silent sacrifices mistaken for obligations. Just clarity, built not with nails and lumber, but with lines that couldn't be erased by comfort or convenience. The house remained theirs. I didn't want it back. I never had. I only wanted them to know it was never just a structure. It was a map of every hour I missed sleep, every meal I skipped, every joint that ached as I poured myself into a future they no longer remembered building. As we left the bank, he paused by the sidewalk, pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was an old drawing, him as a child, holding hands with a stick figure version of me. The caption was in crooked handwriting, "Me and Daddy building our house." He looked up, eyes misted but steady. "I found this in the basement. I didn't remember drawing it, but I think I needed to see it." I took the paper gently, ran my thumb across the faded ink. "That house," I said, "was always more than wood and drywall. It was proof that I saw you, even when I slept on the couch to make room for your dreams." He nodded. This time, no words, just understanding. Weeks later, they invited me over, not as a guest, but as a grandfather. The room I used to sleep in was no longer a yoga space. It wasn't my room again, and I didn't want it to be. But it had a chair, a blanket, and a photo of me and my late wife on the side table. My granddaughter ran into my arms like no time had passed. She handed me a drawing of her own, a crayon picture of a house with 4 windows and a heart over the roof. I smiled, and as the evening drew to a close, my son walked me to the door. "Thank you for not slamming it shut," he said. I looked at him and replied, "Doors don't teach much when they're closed. Sometimes they need to creak just enough to remind people what it takes to keep them open." And now, as I sit back and tell you this story, not to glorify hurt or celebrate revenge, but to reflect on the quiet strength it takes to walk away without burning the foundation, I'll leave you with this. If they box you into a corner, build a doorway. If they move your memories downstairs, move their comfort upstairs. And when they finally ask you why you left, remind them. You only ever wanted a room, not a throne, not a plaque. Just space where love didn't feel like storage. Because even a house built with love can become hollow if the people inside forget to honor its architect. And sometimes, the greatest renovation isn't fixing the house. It's rebuilding the way they see the man who built it.